Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Zarathustra, or Zoroaster as the Greeks called him, was considered a philosopher in the Middle Ages. Raphael's famous painting, The School of Athens, has Zarathustra along with Plato, Aristotle, and other philosophers. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his Also sprach Zarathustra, uses Zarathustra as the mouthpiece for his own philosophy. And Richard Strauss, the great composer, immortalized Zarathustra in his great tone poem, Also sprach Zarathustra, which has that tremendous beginning, which has also been used by Stanley Kubrick in 2001 Space Odyssey. But the Zarathustra of today's talk is not the philosopher, but the founder of the first great monotheistic religion. Zarathustra emanates from the old Rigvedic religion, which believed in the worship of many gods and goddesses. For the first time, he steps forward and says that there is only one God, who he calls Ahura Mazda, or the Lord who is the great creator. He says this is the only God that one should worship, and that this God's worship is as a matter of the revelations given to Zarathustra. In his first great sermon, Zarathustra says that this God, in the very beginning, created twin spirits, exactly alike in every sense, but that God gave them the power of choice. One chose aright and therefore became the good spirit, and one chose to be evil and became the bad spirit. So you see here straight away, there's a very clear line drawn between good and evil. There is no blurring. And as a matter of fact, this rigid dichotomy between good and evil is what, in fact, makes the religion what it is. And it then tells you that the good spirit, Specta Main, lived by the path of truth. And truth alone brings happiness. And please do it for its own sake. Because truth is intrinsically good. Its opposite does not really exist. It's only parasitical. And therefore do it because it's good. Now, very interestingly, he then tells us that, look, I have myself trod this path of truth. It's full of thorns, very difficult. But then at the end, you have Ahura Mazda himself. And as soon as you die, there will be a kind of video playback of your life. And you will then choose your next station. And your next station can either be heaven, loosely described as Garo Deman. In fact, Deman is an English word, domain. Avesta and English are all, in fact, Old Anglo-Saxon are all parts of the old Indo-European group of languages. So you have Garo Deman, or the abode of song. Gavanu is a Gujarati word which means to sing, music. So you have an abode which is music to which you will go. You will be extremely happy in it. And then finally there is this cut-off, Judgment Day, after which you will be resurrected on earth forever and ever. Now, all these ideas, which are Christian and Islamic ideas later, were all clearly delineated here for the very first time. And all revealed, as he says, None of this is something I am telling. This is something that I have been told to tell. So we have this clear dichotomy. We have a beautiful expression in the very beginning of the second Gatha which says that if you live by this truth, you get happiness. And then, happiness to him who gives happiness to whomsoever else. So, it is important to be good only because you will be short-sighted if you are not good. And what is the meaning of not being good again is fleshed out. Being self-centered is not being good. Giving of the self is being good. Above all, if you are willfully deaf or willfully blind, you see something wrong going on and you shy away from it, it is a form of evil. So as you can see, this is a religion which is very difficult to follow. And the only thing that you are told is that you will be happy at the end of it, on earth as well as in the hereafter. So we have this clear dichotomy. We have this path of truth down which we go. We either land up in heaven or its opposite. And its opposite, mind you, is reformative. Because as I said, you have this video playback of what you've done. You yourself realize you have gone wrong. God never steps over you. We are all creatures of will. And that is never trampled upon. And you must will yourself to be able to peaceably coexist with everybody else. Now, this is the entire religion in a nutshell. Of course, there is a great deal of emphasis on the difference between men of power and men of religious spirit. That again is told to. So don't be a man of power, try and live by the path of truth. Do good deeds all the time for your own soul's salvation. There is no other path of salvation. This is important. And do unto others what God will do unto you, namely, give of yourself in every way to a person who is in need. Charity in the widest sense. Only then will the Almighty look after you. Now, in these few lines, I have tried to capture the essence of Zoroastrianism. Now, how did Zoroastrianism spread? It was essentially a Persian religion. The Prophet himself is said to have existed anywhere from, let's say, 3,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago. Nobody really knows. Very, very, very old. And the personage who now bursts on the scene is Cyrus the Great. And this is much after the Prophet gave us this message. Now, Cyrus the Great happened to belong to one of three Persian dynasties, the Achaemenian. Why it was called Achaemenian was that its founder was a man called Achaemenes. And Cyrus happened to be Cyrus the second of that name, who was seventh in line. And he was only king of Anshan, which was a small province of Persia at the time. He became a world conqueror, his world at that point of time. And he was perhaps the only conqueror who conquered in order to liberate. This is something amazing. And he does this in 550 BC. This is now 2,500 years back. So, what does he do? He walks into Lydia, which happens to be Asia Minor or Turkey today, conquers it, and instead of enslaving Croesus, the richest man in the world in those days, makes him his follower, wins him over. He then conquers Babylon. And he says, why do I conquer Babylon? Because the then ruler, a man called Nabonidus, was a man who was now worshipping a god called Sin. And instead of worshipping Marduk, which is what the common people wanted. So he said, I'm liberating all of you, so that all of you are not forced to worship Sin. You can worship Marduk if you like. There's no problem. And most important, he finds the Jews in captivity there and sets them free. Not only does he set them free, he actually issues an edict which says that I will rebuild the temple that Nebuchadnezzar destroyed. Now, if you remember, there was a temple built by David's son Solomon, somewhere around 950 BC. And that temple got destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon came and conquered Jerusalem. He razed it to the ground. And he took away some of the ritual vessels to Babylon. And Cyrus then said, look, not only am I freeing you and letting you people go back to Jerusalem from Babylon, I'm giving you back these vessels, and I will remake your temple for you. It's little wonder, therefore, that the United Nations has a tribute to Cyrus at its very entrance, saying that this man was the very first perpetrator or the first man who respected human rights and certainly religious rights. So though Zoroastrian, he didn't force it down anybody's throat. On the contrary, he said, I wish to liberate all of you. And Xenophon, who written the famous Cyropedia, said that he was called father by all his people, which is a remarkable thing. Great tribute to a man who was in hoary antiquity, 2,500 years ago. Anyway, Cyrus is also spoken about not only by the Greek sources, but by two other interesting sources. One is an 1879 cylinder. Now, it's a little clay tablet which was exposed at the British Museum a couple of years ago. And it's written in Akkadian, which is Babylonian, Old Babylonian. And it says, I, Cyrus, bow down to Marduk, the very first thing, which is your God, the Babylonian God. And I have come here to set all of you free and to see that none of you will have to now live under this horrible yoke. You remember in the Bible, we're told that very interesting thing where Belshazzar was the crown prince just before Cyrus's invasion, has a hand which writes in red, and it says Mene Mene Tekel Uparsit, which translated only means you have been weighed in the scales and you have been found wanting. After which Belshazzar gets destroyed and Babylon gets liberated. So anyway, the Cyrus cylinder therefore tells us of how he liberated Babylon's own inhabitants and gave them back their gods. The Old Testament tells us something very different. And there are 6 books, incidentally, which speak of the Persians, in particular the Achaemenians, this particular dynasty. Now, the second book of Chronicles directly speaks of Cyrus. Ezra speaks of Cyrus. And Deutero-Isaiah, which is the second Isaiah, a prophet who was unnamed, but called the second Isaiah, who also speaks of Cyrus. Incidentally, Deutero-Isaiah calls Cyrus anointed of the Lord, which appellation was only given to a Jewish prophet. So he was put on a very, very high pedestal by these writers. And all of them testify to the fact that he did issue this decree, that he did set the Jews free from Babylon, and that he wanted the temple to be rebuilt. Now, unfortunately, it couldn't be rebuilt before he died. So his son Cambyses came. Cambyses annexed Egypt as part of this huge empire and came and died. And then comes Darius the Great, who happens to be the ruler who perhaps had the largest extent of territory of the Persian Empire at that point of time. And Ezra then tells us that this decree of Cyrus, which said we will rebuild your temple, was lost. So everybody looked for it. And suddenly somebody found it. And he said, look, as a successor emperor, I have to follow what Cyrus has said. So we will rebuild this temple. And the second temple, of which part of the first outer wall is the Wailing Wall of today, was rebuilt with Persian funds under Cyrus the Great. Now, Cyrus the Great, as I told you, came, went. Cambyses came and went. Darius came and went. And Darius' son Xerxes now comes upon the scene. All of you are aware of how Persia tried to conquer Greece. Persia did try to go as far as Greece. but unfortunately lost in 3 major battles. Marathon, Thermopylae, of course, was by deceit, but otherwise Salamis, which was a sea battle, and Brescia. Now, they had to retreat therefore from Greece, and all this happened in the time of Darius and Xerxes. An interesting thing now happens in the time of Xerxes. And for that we have to go to the book of Esther. Again, all Old Testament. And Esther is in fact a Persian name given to a Jewish princess. Her name was Hadassah. And Xerxes somehow got tired of his queen and wanted a replacement. And none better than this young Jewish girl Hadassah, who happened to be the niece of a Jewish gentleman called Mordecai. So Mordecai's niece was brought to court, and Xerxes fell in love with her and made him his queen. But before all this had happened, there was a chap called Haman who was an Amalekite. Now an Amalekite was a traditional enemy of the Jews. And he poisoned the king's ear. And he told the king, look, these people, the Jews, are not good citizens of Persia. They are people who believe in their own God, their own rituals, etc. And they do not bow down to you. So you must do something about it. And therefore Xerxes issued a decree. And in that decree he said that on the 13th of Adar, which is the 13th of a particular month, all the Jews will have to either submit or be destroyed. Now, fortunately, the 13th of Adar was to take place long after he married this young Jewish princess. The young Jewish princess made it clear to him that this was absolutely false, gave him the actual Jewish religion, customs, etc. And then Xerxes said, all right, it may be false, but then you know that the laws of the Medes and the Persians are such that they cannot be altered. So what can we do? We'll therefore issue a decree which will counter this decree. It's the only way out. And the decree which counters this decree will then arm the Jewish people better than the Persian soldiery who was to attack them. So that on the 13th of Adar, instead of the Jews getting destroyed, the Jews destroyed their enemies. And this is then referred to as the Feast of Purim. Now, Purim is a very, very important feast even in Israel today. It's the second most important feast after the Feast of the Passover. So already we see how the Persian religion has affected these people. First and foremost, Cyrus has freed them, given them funds to rebuild their temple. That temple gets rebuilt. And then you see how the Feast of Purim now originates again from Persia. So much so that the Jews who had no real afterlife, you must be aware that in ancient Judaism, the entire focus is on life as you live it. After you die, you go to some shadowy place called Sheol. And Sheol is a place of repose, a place of sleep, something like Hades in Greek mythology. Now, for the first time, you have a sect who are called the Pharisees, because they are now accepting many things from the Pharisees who have taught them this. So the Pharisees now say, no, there is a heaven, there is a hell, there is a judgment day, and there will be a resurrection. So we have a major schism among the Jews themselves. We have the Sadducees who do not believe in this, who are the Jews who retain their customs, and we have the Pharisees. And then of course we have the Essenes, who are the people of Qumran, who are that little sect of persons who are like monks, but keep them aside. So we now find that in Persia itself and in the promised land, in Israel, we have the Pharisees who have come up, who have now taken all these ideas of eschatology and made them their own. And this continues right down till Moses Maimonides, which is in Spain, 13th century. So that Maimonides is able to state in the 13 basic principles of Judaism that heaven, hell and resurrection is a part and parcel of it. So this has done with a direct influence of Zoroastrianism on Judaism. And now, of course, we come to the great persona of Jesus himself. Jesus, as we all know, was born of a virgin. And apart from the virgin birth, was visited by 3 wise men. Now, wise men is a mistranslation of the King James Bible. The original Hebrew is 3 magi. And the magi are Zoroastrian priests. So Zoroastrian priests who were masters of astrology followed a particular star and blessed this child and then went back to Persia and declared that a Soshan, that is a great savior, has been born. Now the Persians were themselves expecting 3 such saviors. Each of them were given a name and each were born to be born of a virgin. And mind you, this is stated in 1000 BC, long before somebody discovered something from the book of Isaiah. So we have this prediction that we will have 3 persons, one called Astvat Ereta, one called Ukshyat Ereta, and one called Soshos. Astvat Ereta is the man who brings back righteousness. The English word erect, truth, righteousness. Ukshyat Ereta is the man who brings back righteousness and makes it wax, spreads it. And the third is yet to come. Each of these persons will be born of a virgin. And this is Zoroastrian belief. So that we have not only Jesus, but we have the Buddha 500 years before him, who in the Jatak stories has a white elephant enter his mother's side. The white elephant being none other than the Holy Spirit, and Buddha being born as a result. So we have this very interesting allusion to 3 Zoroastrian priests who come, who bring frankincense, myrrh and gold, give these gifts to a savior who is to be born like Zarathustra to make righteousness wax again and then return to their place. We also have Christmas. Now, incidentally, Christmas is not really Jesus' birthday at all. Jesus was born when shepherds tend their flocks by night, we are told, in St. Luke, the Gospel of St. Luke. Shepherds, no shepherd in his right mind would be tending his flocks by night in December in Israel. He would do it only in the summer months. So, Jesus was obviously a summer baby. But then how do we get Christmas? How do we get 25th December? Now that's another long story. You have an interesting god called Mitra. Now Mitra himself is taken from the Rig Veda, which is the ancient Aryan faith, and dropped by Zoroaster. As I told you, the Zoroastrian reform was that you do away with all these gods and goddesses and you have only one God, who is a creator God. But then Mitra creeps in again, long after Zoroaster goes, and becomes an angel. So instead of being a god, he's way down in the hierarchy, but he's an angel. And it is this angel who the Persian soldiers at the time of the Second Empire, that is the Parthian Empire, obviously worshipped. And you find a number of Parthian kings being called Mithridates after Mitra. So, when the Parthians met the Romans in battle, and in particular in the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, where one of their great triumvirs, a man called Crassus, was completely defeated and killed, the Roman soldier probably thought that this is because of the god they worship. Our gods have let us down, and therefore borrowed Mitra from the Parthians. Now when they borrowed Mitra from the Parthians, Mitra became bigger and bigger in Rome, and finally he was associated with the sun, and the sun's birthday is 25th December because it happens to be at its lowest ebb at that point of time. So just as we have Christmas today, at that point you had Mitramas, if I may call it that. And Mitramas was celebrated throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, it became actually established by Emperor Aurelian in 274 AD and became a massive festival. Now, when Constantine the Great is said to have converted a lot of Romans to Christianity and said to have converted himself to Christianity, you still had this great pagan festival on 25th December, and you had to do something about it. So what did you do? The simplest thing was to say, all right, replace it and make it Jesus' birthday. So that today we have Mitra's birthday as the largest or the greatest festival in the Christian world. And again, very interestingly, we have in Christianity all these great ideas. Jesus tells us about there being one Father, one God, about there being a heaven, about there being a hell, about there being a judgment day, and about there being a resurrection. In fact, he tells us that I do not know when judgment day will take place, that the Father alone knows. So we have all these ideas again, not necessarily from, let us say, Zoroaster, but it's a confirmation of the revelation given to a prophet who says that I am the first ever to have seen this same Almighty God. Another interesting thing is that you have the devil in the personage of Satan. Now, Satan in the Old Testament is in a couple of books starting with John. And if you see Satan in the Old Testament, Satan is very much under God's control. He gets out of God's control only when Christ appears and makes him a devil in a full-blown sense, that is an antagonist to God. And this is 100% Zoroastrian. Again, not that this was directly from Zoroaster, but the teaching that there is a devil who is antagonistic to God, the equivalent of Angra Mainyu, the spirit who chose wrongly, is again something that Christianity teaches and which has a direct parallel, therefore, with Zoroastrianism. Now, what can Zoroastrianism teach us today? According to me, the first thing it can teach us is that we need to get away from the blurred lines that all of us have today in terms of moral values. At best, our lines are blurred. There is nothing distinct by saying, or something discrete by saying, this is good, this is bad, black, white. Everything is an amalgam of grey, as a result of which a good alchemist can turn white into black and black into white, as we see. That's the first important lesson, according to me, that mankind needs to learn again, to get back to black and white. It is only when you get back to black and white, the truth and the lie, that one can progress in a moral sense and otherwise as well. Secondly, and more importantly, no wars were ever fought by any of these Zoroastrian empires in the name of religion. This is very important. You had the Crusades. There were 8 of them. You had terrible destruction wrought in each one of them, all in the name of either Islam or in the name of Christianity. You had wars fought in the name of jihad, again in Islam. That cannot take place in Zoroastrianism. There has never been a religious war fought in Zoroastrianism. If there has been colonization of some other place, it was either for a good motive, as Cyrus did, or it was to keep the boundary where it was. Because in Sasanian times, which is the Third Empire, the bulwark against the Romans on the eastern side were only the Persians. And it is to keep the Romans away that we had to fight wars. So a very important lesson that one learns is non-violence. The religion is non-violent. Whatever you have to do, discuss. You cannot go by the sword. And no wars are ever to be fought in the name of religion. Third, the ecology and the environment also benefit, because each one of the elements in Zoroastrianism is sacred. In fact, you have a lot of rivers in England which are called Avon, Stratford upon Avon, for example. Avon is nothing but the Avestan word ama, same word, which means waters. And you have to keep waters, air, etc., all the elements completely free of any kind of putrefaction. It's a religious duty on you, so much so that we do not bury our dead. Neither do we cremate our dead. Because if you bury your dead, a corpse will be polluting the earth, which is sacred. Neither will you burn a corpse, because fire is sacred. And by the way, we are called fire worshippers because we believe that fire is an emblem of truth. It is light, it points upwards, it transmutes everything into itself, it burns evil. So, if you worship all these things and keep them free of pollution, this planet would be far better off. And of course, you would ask me that what do we do to our dead? We have what are called towers of silence. I don't know if you heard of them. Because you are put in this tower with wells, etc. And you are exposed to the elements and you are exposed to birds of prey. So in short, you allow nature to take its course. You don't meddle with nature. And that is the very, very important teaching that this faith gives us. So with this little introduction, I think we can get down to the question and answer role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rohinton. Can I maybe exercise chairman's privilege and pop the first question while
Yes,
you're all
please.
thinking of one? You talked about getting back to clear black and white, and you mentioned the idea of the good and the evil twins, and that sounds like what used to be called Manichaeism, and the constant fight between good and evil. Has Zoroastrian thinking evolved from that in any way? And how can you apply that in today's world in the practical?
Sure. Good question. First and foremost, let's give you the answer on Manichaeism. Manichaeism has no real parallel, because Manichaeism belongs to the 3rd century AD, where a prophet called Mani started preaching and took ideas from Zoroastrianism, Buddhism and Christianity. And from Zoroastrianism, he perverted good and evil, according to me. Because what he said was, everything that is material is evil. Everything that is spiritual is good. That's not what Zoroastrianism taught at all. What Zoroastrianism taught was that in the material earth, and the material earth has been created for us because God wanted happiness for man. In this material earth, it is important to realize the distinction between good and evil and to struggle on behalf of good against evil. So that's one part of your question answer. The second is a very interesting part. How would you apply practically the distinction between a black and a white, good and evil? My point is precisely that. My point is, don't be practical. My point is, practicality has brought us to ruin. It is idealism alone that has to be infused back in us. And it is only if we are idealistic in the sense of realizing what is true and realizing what is false, doing what is true and helping those who are doing what is true and fighting what is false, then we can move forward. Now, let me enter an important caveat here. What may be true to you may not be true to me. Right? Truth is relative. We are not speaking of absolute truth, which may be something which exists like Plato's idea. So when we speak of relative truth, what I am saying is that the moment you think something is correct, first and foremost, you respect a dissentient opinion. You don't say, look, if you genuinely believe that the opposite is true, then you are false. No, not at all. The importance is the genuineness of the belief, because you have to have good thought which matches good word, which matches good deed. So if your thought is good as my thought is good, the word is good, but the deed clashes or is exactly opposite, there's no difficulty whatsoever. So long as you do what you think is good. The line which gets drawn is at violence. You may do what you think is good, I may do what I think is good, so long as we are not violent to one another. That's the bottom line. So I hope that answers the question.
Well, it does beg the question, what if the other's idea of good is in direct opposite to your own idea of what is good, and that they are not practically able to coexist?
That's exactly what I said. You respect the fact that the idea is the exact opposite, provided, however, the intent is good, with that proviso. And it is always possible to coexist peaceably with different ideas. There's no problem, ever. The problem arises when the intent becomes perverted or otherwise. So if intent happens to be good and the deed happens to be good, there could be a clash so long as violence is never used one against the other. That's my answer.
Fine. Right. Who else now would like to throw in a question? We've got one here and then one there.
So thank you very much. A very informative talk, and as a Christian, I learned a lot that I didn't know. From your professional career as a justice, concepts of good and evil, quite black and white. How does one dispense justice where there is aspects of grey very much in the middle? And also, how does one accept pleas and mitigation in an environment of black and white, good and evil?
May I answer your question immediately?
Please, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
As a judge, somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong, right? Somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. Now, it is important for you to apply the law in such a way that you see that justice is done. Now, what do I mean by that? The law takes you in a certain direction, all right? And I can give you a very interesting case which actually happened. Rex versus Dudley and Stevens. It's an 1884 judgment. And there were Dudley and Stevens and a cabin boy who were shipwrecked. And they were 1,000 miles from land. And ultimately they realized that they would not survive unless they ate one of themselves. And they took lots. And Dudley got the short straw and would have had to be sacrificed, until he pointed out that the cabin boy was almost half dead. So they lived off the cabin boy, and then an ocean liner picked them up and they were brought here. Lord Coleridge, who tried them for murder, said necessity is absolutely no answer to murder. We have well-known exceptions, grave and sudden provocation, for example. But there's nothing like some uncharted necessity by which you may kill another human being, live off him, and then come back. So they were both sentenced to be hanged. But then there was a huge public outcry. And the safety valve in the system then worked, which was the public outcry followed by the king's pardon. So justice finally got done. Now, this case brings out into bold relief, first, what the law is. Second, its application by a judge. Nobody can say Lord Coleridge was wrong. And third, the safety valve itself, with the system as a whole. I give this case to you only to show you that it is important that every judge first lives by the law, and second, within the law, does whatever justice he can. Justice is not something uncharted. And therefore, when you live within the law is either black or white. Once you actually state what it is, it can't be mushy, it can't be confused. Because if it's confused, it won't be a precedent for the next case. So it has to be black, it has to be white. You lay it down, and then you follow it, and then on facts, deal with the case by which, within the law, you can steer a course towards justice. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Just to follow up on that point, on that particular case, we had the King's Pardon, which saved the day.
Yeah.
And I suppose trial by jury, we've seen Just Stop Oil, etc., that the jury perhaps could have argued saved the day. Well, we don't have trial by jury and it's just the judges, and we no longer have the King's Pardon. Yeah. Then what happens?
Then you have a defective system.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. I've made that question slightly anticipated what I wanted to ask, but I still have to ask it. I was going to illustrate it by the case of Julian Assange recently, which is quite topical. That you have, well, going back then, you said that we must get back to black and white, but then you said that truth is relative. Well, those two concepts I would have thought were completely contradictory, because if truth is relative, then it can't be black or white, because it may be black to you and white to you, or the other way around. So that, and you then say that the only restriction is that you mustn't be violent. Now, if you're a parliamentarian, for example, and you're having to decide whether or not a particular criminal offence should be created, and the Assange case is quite interesting because it involves official secrets and how much your life is exposed, which is a notoriously controversial matter. In the end, you are going to be violent because the criminal law is violent. I mean, if you break it, you're liable to be arrested and maybe cast in prison or fined or whatever, but there will be some kind of violence. So that restriction can't really apply, can it? You've got the criminal law, as the writer said just now, is black and white, has to be. The courts come to a decision one way or the other. But then the result will be, if it's a conviction, violence to the defendant, even though he may think, like Julian Assange, that he's done nothing wrong.
Your question is in two parts. The first part first. First question which you asked is an interesting one, which is that how do you have black and white and relativism together, right? Now, you have relativism with black and white very easily, because my point is that the moment you ascertain truth for yourself, it's at that point that you realize what is true and what is not true. And there is no blurred line. And therefore, equally when he does the exact opposite, there is no blurred line. Both of us are within this relative sphere trying to do what we think is correct. This may be opposite. But both of us have drawn very clear lines in order to do this. Otherwise, you can't do it. So this is the answer to the first part of the question. So far as the second part of the question is concerned, I am not dealing with the law and the state. I am dealing with the human being. When I say do not be violent, a human being cannot be violent to another human being. I am not on state necessity. I am not on the state laying down laws. I am not on the state enforcing its laws. That's very, very far from what any of these prophets speak about. We are talking about each human being qua another human being. And it is there that you be non-violent to your neighbor. I hope I made myself clear.
Yes. Put the microphone from there, at the back of the head.
Where does things like conscience come into your philosophy of life and consciousness, people becoming more enlightened, for example? Can you explain that in terms of Zoroastrianism?
Absolutely. In Zoroastrianism, we have a special word for conscience. It's called sarosh. It comes from a hearing of the inner voice, sruti, from your inner voice. That's your conscience. And it's when you hear your conscience and when you hear what you are told from within, that you then live by the path of truth. That you then have a good thought followed by a good word, followed by a good deed. So conscience is basic, I think, to our faith. And it is by living by your conscience at all times that you ultimately attain what you are supposed to attain.
Can I take a follow-up question though? But say something like, for example, lots of cultures have very different moralities.
Yeah.
And for example, there is honor killing in certain societies.
Yes.
Doesn't that person think he's actually in accordance with his own conscience when he might go out and do something of that nature?
Very good question, to which there's a ready answer. The answer is this. In ancient India, sati used to be committed. Now, I don't know if all of you know what sati is. Sati is that when you have a person who dies, his wife joins him in death and is thrown into the funeral pyre with him, so that she is burned alive. Right? Now that was something that was followed. When the English came and Sir Charles Napier was told that a sati was about to take place and that it was part of their custom, he said, yes, you go ahead with your custom, but we also have a custom. And our custom is to hang those who throw innocent women into a fire. So you follow your custom, I'll follow mine. So that so long as there is no violence, again, that is reprehensible, as in the case of a sati, for example, as in the case of female infanticide, for example. These are practices which, if you rail against and you stop, there's nothing wrong. Because they are violent practices that have to be stopped. But short of that, short of something extreme, everybody gives way to everybody else's custom. I hope I've answered.
Hi there. Not so much a question, but more an expression of gratitude. So, I myself am a Parsi Zoroastrian.
Tell us your name.
Darius.
Darius, surname?
Kumar, right? And I think when I have done my best to explain my faith to my peers, I simply say Homato Rashta, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, and always caveat it with think for yourself and follow your own personal truth. That's my nutshell summary. I think I can speak for both myself and my Catholic wife of 24 years. We both sat here and listened to you, and I think we both learned some incredible things about our respective faiths. We chose to raise our children in both faiths, and we were constantly surprised that, gosh, this seems to be working. There's no contradiction. There are parallels and synergies and similarities, and I think you've helped to explain why they exist. So just thank you very much.
Let me tell you, my latest project is the culmination of 30 years of work. And I have just dictated a book which gives us the essence of every single world religion. Every single world religion. And in the preface of the book, I speak of Ashoka's 12th rock edict. Now, I don't know if all of you know who Emperor Ashoka was. Ashoka was one of the great emperors of India who lived 2,200 years ago. And he was a very violent man. And he had a violent war in what was Kalinga at that time, which is Orissa, modern day Orissa. At the end of that war, he became a complete pacifist and turned to the Buddhist religion. And he had rock edicts put all around, in Persian style, as the Achaemenian kings had, in Persia. And the 12th rock edict is a beauty. It says that Piyadasi, that is, he who is beloved of the gods, that is the emperor himself, would like all his subjects to do the following. First, be well informed. Now, how are you well informed? You study everybody else's faith. First. Second, you try and get the good points of everybody's faith. Third, praise those good points. Fourth, never denigrate them. Because when you denigrate them, you are really denigrating your own faith. And if you do all this together, we can live in concord, beautiful word used in that rock edict. It's only then that you live in concord. Now, it is this which was the impetus for my book, which will be released next year, and I hope all of you will buy it. Because it is very important that we know what our neighbor's religion is. There are so many cobwebs in so many minds and so many misconceptions that it is important to know what are the good points of each faith and try and follow and emulate the good points of each. I'm very glad you are following this path on your own.
Let me quote a personal experience of mine. I wanted to come to terms with the Quran as Islam emerged as a
May I interpose? Have you read the Quran?
Yes, what I was going to say. And I marked up the Quran in red and green for the good and bad points. And the way well, not so good points. And the way I did it was just each day I opened the Quran at a page and read a couple of pages and just highlighted them. I have to say that there are a lot more red marks than green marks. That's all I can say about that.
You wouldn't have been a good judge. Extremely biased point of view. I can tell you, having read the Quran, that I find the green marks to be 90 and the red marks to be, say, 10 maximum.
Yeah, it may well be.
Yeah, because see the important points and the highlights of the Quran. First and foremost, it reminds you that there is one God, right? It tells you He is compassionate, that He is merciful. Two fantastic qualities. Then it tells you that there is no compulsion in religion. This is very important. They may not follow it. But this is chapter 2, verse 256. The Al-Baqarah chapter, which is the longest, specifically says in verse 256, there is no compulsion in religion. Then when you are told to fast, for example, and in the month of Ramadan, you fast because that's the holy month when the Prophet first got his revelation. It says old people are exempt. It's very rational. The young are exempt. The sick are exempt. And the moment you cannot fast for whatever reason, make it up by doing something good. I can't think of anything more rational than that. And don't forget, at a time when people married 1 million wives, or could, there was a restriction. Do not marry more than 4. And second, try and treat them equally. However hard you might try, it's very difficult to treat them equally. Chapter 4, verse 4, end with verse 129. Alright? So, you are also then told that the 4 you marry is because you wish to socially accommodate people who are orphans and widows. Now, all this is the Quran. And you have, of course, chapter 9, which is always trumpeted about, but then nobody knows that chapter 9 was the most difficult point in his life. When he had fled to Medina, and he was being pursued by a lot of guys, and unless he fought back, he'd have been finished. So, according to me, each text, as you said, has green and red, right? it's important for us today, particularly in today's world, to emphasize the green and not emphasize the red in each, and try and learn from them.
Right. And here and then Simon.
Thank you very much for your talk. In Zoroastrianism, how do you explain, or do you have a basis for the unique value of each human being, and also how do you explain our nature, our rationality, our morality?
It's a very interesting passage in one of our chief priests. He was a genius. There's a chap called Adarbad Maraspan, and he lived in the 3rd century AD. I'll tell you what one of his sayings was before I answer the question. He said, there's no point having courage unless accompanied with wisdom. Think, a terrorist is very courageous, but not wise. There's no point having a good intent unless it's translated into a good deed. Otherwise, it's just with you. There's no point having intelligence unless accompanied by vision. There has to be something which you are trying to achieve with that intelligence. And finally, God has given you wealth so that you are generous. Now, this man came out with what could perhaps be preordained, which is your date of birth, your date of death, maybe your marriage. But the fact that you have will, it may not be free, is something which he extols and says, look, all of us are creatures of will. Zoroaster in his first sermon specifically says, each of you decide for yourself. Naram shvaksha panuya is the avesta. Naram is man for man. Each decide for himself. So it is very important for you to remember that ethics or morality are in your hands. Maybe you've been dealt a very, very poor hand by fate. Maybe. Maybe somebody else has been dealt a fabulous hand by fate. But the ultimate life is the life which is really to come. This is a flash in the pan. Whatever you can do now in terms of good and fighting evil will ultimately gain you huge benefits. So don't concentrate on what's happening to you right now as much as to realize and take within your hands the fact that you can do your own bit of good and you can fight your own bit of evil.
Well, thank you very much. I found that absolutely fascinating and a wonderful diversion from the football. We are so grateful to you. Now, my question is really about the place of the faith in the contemporary world. What's the distribution of the religion across the world? I understand there's quite a lot in India. What happened in Persia and what is now Iran? What are the numbers, what's the distribution, and some of the practicalities about how it's organised as a religion. Are there priests, are there temples or places where you pray? And the final question, because you're all keen on membership rolls in a place like a Reform Club, how can we join?
Very nice. Now, let me answer the last thing first. How can we join is a question that has been asked in a number of countries and more so in Sweden somehow. I don't know how. Sweden. Now I have this Bengali sounding name, Gautam Bhattacharya. Right? Born and bred in Sweden. He wanted to contact me and he came and met me in New Delhi. And he says, greetings to a fellow Zoroastrian. I said, you're a Zoroastrian? I said, yeah. He said, I converted. Where did you convert? In Sweden. Who converted you? He said, there is some movement going around in Sweden where a lot of people now are taken up by the morality aspect of the religion. And they call it the good religion as a result. And a number of people apparently have come across to the Zoroastrian fold. And they are Navjotik. Now, a Navjot means literally a new birth. So a child when it's 8 or 9 has a white sadra put onto it, which means a white vest, and a kasti which it wears all the time, which is as red, to signify that you are now part of the Zoroastrian faith. And it seems the chief priest from Yazd in Iran comes over to Sweden, does these Navjots and goes back. So there has been some kind of resurgence in Sweden. There has been a lot in North America. There has been quite a bit in Japan, of all places. And unfortunately, it's in India that we are going backwards. Because our entire emphasis there is on Parsi versus Zoroastrian. And Parsi has become something like a caste. See? So unless you're born with a Parsi father, you can't enter the faith. The strength of the faith in the old days was, nobody forcibly converted, but nobody shut the door on you either. So it was very important in Sasanian times, for example, that nobody forcibly converted anybody. But if you wanted to become, you came in, there's no problem. It's only in India that the conversion issue took a turn for the worse in the 15th century and then became hard and fast. So that in India, unless the Supreme Court does something, I don't see the religion spreading. And the demographics which you asked are startling, because the number of old people alive now are far greater than the number of young people. So that it's slated, according to me, to die unless something radical is done in India. But outside India, it seems to be flourishing.
And the question about organisation.
Organization, see, we do not have a pontiff, we don't have a pope. We do have Vada Dasturjis, that are persons who are, let us say, the chief priest of a particular area. And under them you have all the other priests, and you have rituals, and you have death ceremonies, and you have the works of any other religion. And all this takes place in what we call agyaris, which are fire temples. Because in a temple, you have what is called a consecrated fire to which you pray. An ordinary temple will have a consecration of 3 days. An Atash Beram, which is a fire of victory, will have a consecration which will last a year. Because there are 16 grades of fire which are mixed. From the lowest, which is the corpse's fire, to lightning fire. And unless lightning fire is attracted somewhere, caught somewhere and brought, this cannot become an Atash Beram. So we have 8 such Atash Berams, which are the big temples, so to speak, the cathedrals in India. And the rest we have fire temples which are numerous all over.
I'm sure I'll be corrected on some of the specifics, but I thought it might also be helpful to understand. I think one of the reasons why there is this, philosophically, Zoroastrianism is an open religion, and Zoroaster used to go and welcome people to the faith. When I believe we fled Persia and landed in India, one of the conditions of entry was that we agreed not to convert people to the faith. And I think there are sort of some more extreme factions within India who propagated that, and even though the faith as a whole is dying and decreasing in number, they're holding on to some of those, what I would say, dated rules. So I don't know if you have anything to
That's not correct.
Oh, really? Okay.
Because see, we have 2 sources, and both sources tell us that there were 5 conditions on which that particular Yadav ruler allowed us to enter. And the 5 conditions have been laid down like this. 1, you will now adopt the Gujarati language. 2, your women will wear the sari. 3, you will marry only after sunset, which was some local custom. 4, you will not bear arms. most important. And 5, you will teach us your faith. Exact opposite. You teach us what your faith is about.
That's fascinating.
And 16 Sanskrit shloks were in fact composed by our priests who were very smart, practical guys, to tell them, look, we are nothing but part of you. I mean, we were part of you ages ago and we have now come back. So, this bogey of this being a condition is not correct.
Fascinating.
Never will. Another interesting thing you told me. You said that you were married to a Catholic lady, right? And that you bring your children up under both faiths. I think that's a great thing. It's also important to realize that what Christianity tells you about that you must sow, so shall you reap, is very much there in every red letter Bible. I don't know if you've ever read a red letter Bible, which is the sayings of Christ himself. See, it's only at an ecumenical council in 325 AD in Nicaea that Christianity took a different turn. And that was because of the Emperor Constantine. Constantine called bishops from all over and diverted the issue from ethics to the person of Christ. And then everybody asked, what is Christ? Is he a prophet? Is he wholly divine? Is he partly divine? Constantine resolved it by saying, am I not divine? I'm your emperor. Everybody said, of course you're divine. Then he is divine. And stopped there. And everything rested on one word, homousios or homusios, Greek word. Either you are of like substance with the Father, that is God, or you are of the same substance. And the Nicene Creed, which is followed by the Catholic Church today, is Christ is of the same substance. One. Second, again you had this fight about, but he is human as well. I mean, he may have been born of a virgin, but he is human. His father may have been the Holy Spirit, but he was human, he was born and he died. So at the Council of Chalcedon in 451 AD, you had a compromise which was that he is wholly divine and wholly human, like oil and water, and the two don't mix. And that is what today the Catholic Church follows. Sorry to have digressed into all this now, since you asked.
A small. A small question. So I got interested in Zoroastrianism when I was in Iran in a temple, and I tried to do some university talks and lectures. And there is a question that I would really like to hear, your views on, to see if it's confirmed or if it's just someone's opinion, that they heard about. But I heard that Zoroaster himself was a very educated man, and he also, some people say, was very educated in Vedas, if it's the correct translation, and he knew them by heart, and he was kind of in a sort of a priest, and then he completely changed his ways. Can you a little bit elaborate? Did he take anything from that?
Yeah, sure. See, he described, what we have of Zarathustra today, don't forget, I told you that he may have lived 6,000 years before us, and at the very least 3,000 years before, maybe more than that. So what we know, we only know from the hymns he sang. Somehow or the other they have come down to us because they are poetry and not prose. And they were conned by rote by the priests. And a whole series of priests conning the same thing by rote made it clear that the same thing came down. So that we know what he said, what he actually said. Now, fortunately for us, he describes himself as an Agnihotri. An Agnihotri is a priest, a fire priest in the old religion. So that gives you some idea of the fact that he may well have been a priest of the old religion, right? Which is the Rigvedic religion, the Vedas, as you say. But then again he tells you that, look, the very word Ahura, for example, that he used as the first word for God, Ahura Masta, is a Rigvedic word. And in the Vedas, it is Asura. It's in Avestan that it becomes Ahura. Alright? So, an Asura in the Rig Veda in the beginning, was a person who was a very high lord, not like a dev, who was an underling god. And Asura was a person who was in charge of morality. So Varun and Mitra were described as Asuras in the Rig Veda. Now he takes the same word Asura and says Lord, but neither Varun nor Mitra nor anybody else, and coins a new word for the first time, which is not in the Rig Veda. And that this Ahura now is the only Ahura that you pray to because he is the creator of everything that exists. So, to answer your question, yes, he does come out of the Rig Veda and completely throws over the old faith and installs the new one, saying there is only one God. This is what he has revealed to me, and this is how we are doing.
Can you say something? You mentioned a little bit about idealism and materialism one stage when we were talking. Perhaps you can explain a bit more about what Zoroastrianism, the cosmology, and the way the world came about, and time and space that somehow.
Sure. See, Zoroastrian cosmology is something of a much later period. You have as many as 5 languages in this religion. So imagine how old it is. You have Avesta, Old Avesta, Younger Avesta, Pahlavi, Middle Persian, and then finally our modern day Persian. So you're dealing with a very, very old faith. And so far as time, space, etc. were concerned, they were not spoken about or emphasized by the Prophet himself. They come up much later. And they come up in a book of creation called the Bundaishan. Now the Bundaishan is a book of creation which pertains to Sasanian times. If you remember, I told you there were 3 dynasties. You have the Achaemenian dynasty, which was from 550 BC to about 331 BC when Alexander knocked Persia off. Then you have the Parthian period, 247 BC to about 224 AD. And then finally Sasanian, 224 to 651, after which the Arabs conquered us and we came here. Right? Now all this took place in the 3rd dynasty. And the Bundaishan is therefore a Pahlavi book. And it's supposed to be a redaction of an older Avestan book called the Damdat Nask, which we have lost. Now this book of creation speaks of time as being either cyclical or linear, and also speaks of Zurvan, which is a concept which crept in later, as being time out of whose bosom both God and the devil emerged. Very different from Zoroaster's teaching. And you have a period now of 12,000 years. In the first 3,000 years, God conceived his creation. The next 3,000 years, God actually materialized that creation. In the third 3,000 years, the devil in the form of a serpent jumps in, screws everything up. And the fourth is what we are going through. And therefore, we've got to fight on God's side all the time. Because ultimately, though the devil is counteracting everything God does, he is not omniscient, which God is. And God knows he will destroy.
Any more questions, comments?
Thank you so much. I'm a Zoroastrian, and I didn't know as much as whatever you said. I knew very little, so I'm really grateful that I came here today and listened to you. I just have a question about resurrection. It's something I don't know anything about, and how is it common in all the faiths?
See, resurrection follows from Judgment Day. Judgment Day is a cut-off at which point all souls are gathered together. And then you have different views. Now, for example, the Christian view could possibly be that there are some which cannot be redeemed. And the wages of sin is death. The soul goes. The Zoroastrian view is every single soul will be redeemed. And finally, everybody lives in what is called frashokereti, which is a resurrected state, where your body is astral, where you do not age, and where you have the gift of what is called immortality, amere tat. But all that can only be if you are fit to peaceably coexist with your neighbor. Until that happens, this cannot take place.
So what happens if it doesn't happen? Are you reborn?
No, it is bound to happen because ultimately the Lord, who is omniscient, tells us that it happens because every soul ultimately will choose a right for itself. It has gone wrong here, it may go wrong later in heaven and hell. But ultimately, by the time judgment day arrives, every soul will be made to choose a right. And then you are given this beautiful thing about a soul going, it feels as if you're going through warm milk for you to get to the other side, or it boils you and boils the whatever's left of the bad stuff in you so that you are able to cross.
Just one more question. Could you say
Can you
something
come in
about-
front if you don't know?
Could you say something about the cultural effect or impact of Zoroastrianism?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
In terms of culture, see, Parsis are very fond of food. And they have devised a cuisine which is entirely their own, which is pretty heavy. It's not something that you can digest easily. But each dish is something which is unique. So that culturally you have Parsi food which is completely different. You have the Parsi language, which of course is Gujarati, since we said we promised that we will, but it's a dialect of Gujarati and spoken in a very different way from which a Gujarati would speak. And culturally, I believe we are a happy, outgoing lot. We like meeting with one another. We like pulling each other's legs. Parsi humor, again, can be at its worst be pretty bad. But whatever it is, ultimately, you see you somehow are able to laugh at yourself, which is the important thing. So culturally, I would say it is a community which is interesting in that when one Parsi is with another, somehow one always finds some kind of commonality in all these things and is able to be happy as a result and encourage everybody towards happiness of whichever kind he may choose.
That sounds like a very good note on which to end.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions or comments? No? Well, in that case then, I think, thank you very much.
Thank you.